Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Stephen Parker. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canberra, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 10th in the series of national security lectures convened by my colleague, Lieutenant General Professor Peter Ley. Before we proceed further, can I ask you to switch all mobile phones to silent or phasers to stun, whatever handheld device you have with you. I'd like to acknowledge, as we try always to do at such occasions at the University of Canberra, which is that we are meeting on land of which the Ngunnawal people are the traditional custodians. I extend my respect to their elders past and present and to any Indigenous people here today. I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Dennis Richardson, the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, to commence the University of Canberra's National Security Lecture Series for 2011. The department is a key player in Australia's national security community. It's a privilege to have Mr. Richardson here to give his views on the subject, given that he and his department are intimately involved in many of the issues that have such an impact on our future security and our prosperity. As has been obvious throughout this lecture series, Australia's security interests are global and extensive. They're complex, dynamic and long-term, but also often immediate, such as when providing consular support to the many Australians who are travelling the world. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has a broad portfolio. It includes diverse issues such as counter-terrorism, non-proliferation, arms control and disarmament, people smuggling and trafficking in persons, human rights, environmental issues and treaties, trade and the environment, and our engagement with international organisations such as the G20, the OECD, the United Nations, ASEAN and APEC. Portfolio agencies of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade include AusAid, Austrade and ASIS, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service. So I'm sure you'll agree that this is a big and difficult job. It's particularly so when you consider the nature of the current global environment. We face a fragile global economy, a changing regional landscape, and the rise of China. And in the last few weeks, we're all wondering about the strategic implications of the wind of change, to use Harold Macmillan's expression, which is sweeping across authoritarian regimes in North Africa and the Middle East. Dennis Richardson is very well qualified to be the Secretary of DFAT. He's been Director General of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation and our Ambassador to the United States of America. He's also served as a Deputy Secretary of the Department of Immigration and Multicultural Affairs, the head of the review of the intelligence community post the Cold War in 1992, and a principal advisor to the Prime Minister in 1990 and 1991. Unlike most other departmental secretaries, Mr. Richardson has the distinct and obvious pleasure of working for two ministers, Minister Rudd as the Foreign Minister and Minister Emerson as the Minister for Trade, a cup which is indeed full to overflowing. At a time when we are very proud that one of our graduates, Ms. Peter Compton, has recently been accepted into the DFAT undergraduate programme, it's a particular pleasure to see Mr. Richardson at the University of Canberra, and I invite you to welcome him.
Thanks very much, Vice-Chancellor. It's a great pleasure to be here. I thought I might talk a little bit about Australia's global interests and some of the bigger changes going on there. I suspect a lot of what I say in that context won't be new, but it's worth saying. I also want to talk a bit about the implications of those changes for Australia's interests and how DFAT pursues those interests. And in talking a bit about the latter, I want to give a few practical examples of how the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade contributes to the pursuit of our national interests. And at the end of it, very happy to take questions on anything at all. There's a lot that I'll leave out, there's a lot that I'll gloss over, and if you want to go into more detail or pursue any particular lines of inquiry that I've overlooked, then simply ask. First of all, I'd like to address Australia's global environment. I think we're all aware that major shifts are afoot in world power dynamics. Global power is becoming more diffuse than at any time since the Second World War. Over the last 65 years, we've had 45 years of two superpowers and 20 years of a single superpower. The power of the United States remains enormous. It will remain the world's leading power in total terms for the foreseeable future. Its economy, still the world's biggest, matches capital with technology, expertise and opportunity, and it brings all of that together like no other country does or can. It has pervasive cultural institutions, and it has global reach, including through its many alliances and security partnerships. But relativities have changed, are changing, and will continue to change. And it's important to put some of that in historical context. At the end of the Second World War, US GDP constituted about half of the then global GDP, of course with much of Europe and much of Asia broken by the war. By about 1990, US share of GDP had become around 23-24% of global GDP. And it's interesting to note that since the early 90s, it has moved from around 23-24% of GDP to about 20% of GDP today. And looking ahead, obviously, US share of GDP, Australia's share of GDP, West Europe's share of GDP is going to continue to decline. That is a good thing, not a bad thing, because our contribution to global GDP is declining, not because we're doing badly, but because other countries are coming up, and that is good. And the relativities are really going to change quite big time. Martin Wolf, in a recent article, in fact in an article in the Financial Times of the 2nd of February, he noted that in PPP terms, the IMF calculates that the rich world's share of GDP, which was 63% of global GDP in 2000, had dropped to 53% within a decade and would fall to below 50% over the early part of the current decade between 2010 and 2020. Behind the US and other traditional major powers which make up the G7, G8 are significant emerging economies which are also making their new power felt and will do more so in the coming decades. The most dynamic example of this historic shift is, of course, the shift of economic and strategic weight from the west to the east. And the two best examples are the obvious ones, and that is China and India. China's re-emergence is especially significant. By 2015, the IMF calculates that in the preceding 25 years, China will have grown its economy 25-fold. China is expected to rival the United States in terms of economic size within 2 decades, measured within nominal GDP terms. Put in PPP terms, they will probably become larger than the US by 2020. In that time, over the next 10 to 20 years, 200 million more Chinese will move to cities, with implications for resource requirements and the like. India is also well on the way to big economy status, though its path via a developed services sector and domestic demand is somewhat different to that being pursued by China's export-driven growth. In the coming 20-odd years, 250 million of India's people will move from the countryside to its cities. So in India and China combined, over the next 20-odd years, 450 million people will move into cities, with the implications that that has for global demand and the like. The global financial crisis only accelerated those trends. And as Martin Wolf again noted in his article of the 2nd of February, in the 5 years since 2005, that is in 5 years, the US economy grew an accumulated 5%, the UK and Japanese economies grew an accumulated 2%, the Eurozone grew an accumulated 4%, India grew an accumulated 47%, and China grew an accumulated 69%. There will also be, when we look ahead over the next 10 to 20 years, other significant global growth centres. Latin America, especially Brazil, Turkey, the Gulf and Africa. But the major centre of global growth will be Asia, with China and India accounting for, while they will account for most of the growth, Indonesia, Vietnam and others will also expand significantly, and Japan will remain one of the world's biggest economies. So don't overlook Japan. Rising economic power will translate in time to rising military spending and power in our own region. China spends 5 to 6 times what it did on defence 20 years ago. However, it still only spends around a fifth or so of what the US spends on defence, though China concentrates its spending in a more targeted local way, whereas US spending is more global. Other countries in our region will also increase their defence spending over the next couple of decades as their economy grows. So our strategic circumstance is very different to that of most European countries. It is not intellectually credible to compare what we spend on defence as a percentage of GDP to what individual European countries spend on defence as a percentage of GDP, or what Canada spends on defence as a percentage of GDP. Their circumstances are very different to ours. I outline these changes to draw some implications for global power dynamics and global leadership. Asia's growth means that during the course of this century, we will see for the first time in a couple of hundred years, economic weight centring on neither Europe and or North America, but it will centre on Asia, and we haven't seen that for several hundred years. The United States, we will also see the United States exercising its leadership in new ways. The US will do more, as Secretary of State Clinton has said, to convene, to connect, to create partnerships aimed at solving shared global problems. And this leads to the second feature of Australia's global environment. Much more will need to be negotiated among major and middle powers in the 21st century. The world faces significant security and economic challenges that require the input of a wider range of players than in the past. No one country can tackle on its own global terrorism, nuclear proliferation, climate change and the like. No one country on its own can achieve the return of the world's financial system to health, nor global trade liberalisation, nor the fulfilment of the Millennium Development Goals, or set new globally recognised norms on, for instance, cyberspace. There will be a variety of forums in which the challenges of the 21st century will be negotiated. The United Nations will remain fundamentally important. It remains the premier global body promoting a rules-based international order, and it's specified, and some of its specific agencies do a lot of tremendous work which we often overlook, whether it's the UNHCR, whether it's UNICEF or the like. And the UN Security Council, despite its shortcomings, remains vitally relevant. The UN Security Council sets the mandates under which Australia's 3,000 men and women in uniform work and do their jobs in Afghanistan, East Timor, the Sudan, Egypt and Cyprus. And it is the UN Security Council that set the sanctions that we must apply against Iran and North Korea. But multilateralism is in flux. There is a need to address global challenges multilaterally more than ever before, but there is great difficulty in achieving results through major multilateral bodies, as we've seen in the UNFCCC with climate change and the WTO, both of which bodies have been grinding on slowly for a decade or more, pursuing their very legitimate and proper goals. The world is feeling its way forward somewhat on the global and regional institutions of governance that might emerge more significantly in this century. In the economic sphere, we've already had the rise of the G20. It was formed following the Asian financial crisis in 1997-98, but did not come together as a leaders' forum until the global financial crisis in 2008, bringing to the table those countries and leaders that had to act to avert global economic catastrophe. It embeds embedded in the G20 are the major emerging economies such as China, India and Brazil, and to have their voice in global economic governance is obviously essential. It is no longer something which the G7, G8 can do either in strict economic terms or in terms of credibility and weight. The G20, in becoming the premier forum for global economic governance, reflects the modern reality of global power shifts. The G20 represents 88% of global GDP, 78% of global trade flows and almost 2/3 of the world's population. It brings together at leader level 5 from Europe, 5 from Asia, 5 from the Americas and 5 others. And of course also just as we're in the European, West European and others grouping in the UN, we're in the others grouping in the G20, along with Turkey, Saudi Arabia and South Africa. The G20 is not perfect, but it's big enough to be broadly representative, provided it stays within its lane and recognises the proper role of the UN in various areas, but it's also small enough to be effective. In our own region, architecture is also evolving. Last year, in fact in November of last year, we saw the formal decision to bring the United States and Russia into the East Asia Summit, and they attended that summit at Foreign Minister level. Australia, the US, Japan, China, Korea, India, Indonesia and the other ASEANs are now all in that one body. But it's particularly important that it brings together the United States, Japan, China and India, because the interaction between those four countries fundamentally determines the politico-strategic environment in which we as a country live. And that was the essence of the goal set by then Prime Minister Rudd in June of 2008 when he launched his Asia Pacific Community Initiative. Because it is the East Asia Summit which alone brings together those four countries with a mandate which enables it to pursue economic, political, security and strategic issues. At the same time, that global consensus on global challenges has been harder to achieve. Globalisation itself has been connecting up the world more than ever. And this comes to the third feature of the global environment looking ahead, and that is we're going to have vastly greater mobility of just about everything. Mobility of goods, finances, information, skills, and especially of people. And we think of the movement of people very often in terms of the ways we hear it presented in terms of immigration, illegal flows and the like. But the vast majority of flows that I'm talking about are legal movements of people. For instance, more Australians now travel, live, study, work and tour abroad than ever before, with now well over 1 million Australians doing that at any one time. In other words, at any one time there's about well over 1 million, well over 1 million out of 22 million. That's about 5%. So we have 5 to 7% of Australians overseas at any one time. However, while much of Australia's global environment has and is changing, a lot of it isn't changing. And what is enduring is just as important as what is changing. For instance, the security and prosperity of our near neighbours is always a vital feature of any country's environment. And the most important constants in Australia's environment are our close neighbours. Indonesia, other countries in Southeast Asia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, the Pacific Islands. A prosperous, stable Indonesia is, of course, critical. We have a strategic partnership and the two countries are increasingly working together both regionally and globally. And in respect of the latter, for the first time, the leaders of Australia and Indonesia sit around the table on a regular basis discussing global issues at the G20. Obviously, Australia has no closer partner than New Zealand, and indeed it is more than a partner. As the Prime Minister said last week in her address to members of Parliament in Wellington, that is, before the tragic earthquake in Christchurch. She said, "Australia has many partnerships and friendships, but New Zealand alone is family." And I think that's right. We have a core interest for Australia is the stability, security and prosperity of the Pacific Island countries. We've stepped up engagement to assist the region meet development goals and address climate change, humanitarian disasters, resource protection and also maritime security. Now let me draw some implications from the broad changes and the broad enduring features of the global environment that I talked about, and let me weave in through that some examples of what DFAT does on a day-to-day basis. And the first question for DFAT is, what do we do to help ensure the changes we're talking about in relative power doesn't undermine the security of our own region? Because it is that security that underpins the prosperity that we've enjoyed for so long. The past 4 decades have been good for Australia. We have benefited from globalisation and from Asia's growth. And 2/3 of our goods trade is now with Asia. Over 3/4 of our goods exports and over half of our services exports go to Asia. Regional growth has delivered a fundamental shift in our terms of trade. This is both a good and a bad thing. As Glenn Stevens has noted, 5 years ago, a shipload of iron ore was worth 2,200 flat-screen television sets. Today, a shipload of iron ore is worth about 22,000 flat-screen TVs. That's partly due to the reduction in the price of flat-screen TVs, but it is also been due to an increase in the price of iron ore by a factor of 6. But the realities, the power realities of the last 40 years won't, of course, be the power realities of the next 40 years. The big powers will need to work together in some way regionally and globally. In particular, the US, China, Japan and India. Australia is in the front row of this as this dynamic plays out, and our interests are closely engaged in a way in which we've not seen them engaged at any time in our history in respect of that dynamic. And it's interesting to note that for the first time in our history, for the first time ever in our history, our top trading partner is neither an alliance partner nor is it a democracy. I don't draw any conclusions from that, but it's simply a little fact worth noting. In the same way as China is the United States' second largest trading partner. So the dynamic between the United States and China, very, very different to the dynamic you saw between the United States and the Soviet Union between the end of the Second World War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. However, while all of this change and the change that lies ahead will pose a lot of challenges, we're not without some weight and influence of our own. I personally believe that as a country we tend to think of ourselves as small and we tend to often present ourselves as small. It is successive governments have been fond of talking about Australia punching above its weight, which is a code word for saying, well, we do everything you could reasonably expect us to do, plus a lot more. Well, I think it's an interesting issue whether we look at ourselves as punching above our weight, or whether we ask ourselves, do we punch up to our weight? Our economy is the 13th. Well, let me put it this way. There are 192 countries in the United Nations. We're the 6th largest country in the world in land area. When it comes to population, when you run this little test with most people and you say, right, 192 countries in the UN, this is how big we are in land area, where do we come in terms of population out of the 192 countries? The majority of audiences that I've ever posed that question to put us somewhere between 100, 120, somewhere like that. Well, of the 192 countries that make up the United Nations, only about 49 or 50 have a bigger population than Australia. Most countries that make up the United Nations are smaller than Australia in population. And of the 192 countries that make up the United Nations, we have a bigger economy than 13 or 14 of them. We have the 13th or 14th largest defence budget in the world, measured in absolute dollar terms, not in terms of relativities. So, you know, we do have, when you look at us compared to the United States, when you look at us compared to the very big powers, yes, we're small, but the world is full of relativities. And when you look at us relative to others, we are not small. We're not big, but we are not insignificant. When you add to that the fact that we're one of the world's leading suppliers of resources and energy, when you think about the fact that we have a lot of what the world will wants now and over the next 100 years, whether it be food, whether it be resources, we produce amounts of that sufficient for export. About 70–75% of our agricultural production goes overseas. And in different ways, we are an important partner to each of the United States, China, Japan and India. All of this means that we're going to have to exercise skillful statecraft, and Australia and DFAT does have an important role there. While our budget is tight, and while we have to watch our pennies, we have a diplomatic and trade network of 95 posts in 77 countries. We have the smallest diplomatic footprint of any of the G20 countries, but nonetheless we are represented in a good many countries. And DFAT has around 4,000 Australian and locally engaged staff globally, and we're particularly strong in our own region, as you would expect. Among our top priorities is maintaining a central alliance with the United States as it continues to play its role in the Asia Pacific. And for 7 decades, the United States has been the region's strategic guarantor, and it's been that guarantee that has enabled, which has provided the umbrella for the region to grow in the way it has.
Like Vietnam, for example.
Yes, like Vietnam. We need, of course, to be developing and deepening security relationships and understandings with other key countries of the region. And that's why on Tuesday of this week, our High Commissioner in Dili was hosting a lunch for India's Chief of the Air Force prior to his visit to Australia in late February. And it's the sort of activity that we're engaged in around the region the whole time. So DFAT leads Australia's work with key partners to develop what are fruitful individual relationships, but as the Foreign Minister has said, we also need to do more. We need to work to a common sense of rules-based security cooperation in our region and a commonly agreed rules of the road in Asia. We believe we need better regional architecture to help deliver that. Now that we've got the membership of the East Asia Summit right, we now need to work on the agenda. We strongly support the current agenda, including regional economic integration, financial sector capacity building and strengthening education cooperation. The forward agenda will also need to encompass a capacity for leaders to have a substantive dialogue on security issues. Beyond the realm of security and regional architecture, we need to be building deeper political and economic relations with countries of significance to Australia. We need to deploy diplomatic craft to achieve this, listening to what of importance is happening in countries where we operate, interpreting this for Canberra, looking for ways to advocate our policy interests, thinking of opportunities to take relations to a new level through high-level visits, bilateral agreements and other practical forms of cooperation. That's why our ambassador in Seoul, who is also our ambassador in Mongolia, is this week accompanying the Prime Minister of Mongolia on a visit to Australia. He's here to advance economic and political ties, and the economic ties with Mongolia are particularly significant in the resource sector. And that is why our ambassador in Tokyo earlier this week hosted a lunch with the Japanese Parliamentary Senior Vice Minister to discuss the Australia-Japan FTA and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. To do this well over the longer term, DFAT needs to develop officers who understand the countries to which they've posted, and DFAT has done that very well over a long period of time, and officers who can think, advocate and persuade. And that is again why we've put a lot more over the last 12 months into foreign language training. And that's why we've greatly expanded our diplomatic footprint in India over the past year, including opening new posts in the financial and commercial centres of Mumbai and Chennai. India is now Australia's third biggest export market. A decade ago, it was our 13th biggest export market. And we will need, over time, to expand our network and expertise to countries like Brazil, Turkey and others. The image Australia has in big and emerging powers, not just in government circles, but in the broader community, is also very significant. And building a positive image over the long term and responding to reputational risks is a job DFAT does. Hence Australia's presence at the 2010 World Expo in Shanghai, including the project to design, manage and fund Australia's pavilion. We spent in total 83 million on that pavilion, of which 72 million was taxpayers' money. So it's reasonable to ask, what did we get for that 72 million of taxpayers' money? The pavilion attracted 8.2 million visitors. It was one in 9 visitors to the expo site visited Australia's pavilion, and there were 245 other pavilions that people could visit. It was rated amongst the top 5 pavilions by visitors to the expo. It was visited by 5 members of China's leadership group, including its president, and we held 219 high-quality business events for 16,000 guests, Chinese and Australian entrepreneurs and policymakers, with events including an Australian Financial Services Summit, a China-Australia Higher Education Forum, and an Australia-China Youth Dialogue. The Expo was the centrepiece of a year-long Image Australia campaign in China, and later this afternoon in Beijing, our ambassador will open a multimedia exhibition that continues that campaign. As I've made clear, India is another country in which Australia needs to build its understanding, image and influence. But our image was badly damaged by attacks on Indian students in 2009 and 2010. And we have a 3 to 5 year project to rebuild Australia's image there. It will take that long. And we're already planning a 2012 year of Australian culture in India. It's also why this week our High Commissioner in New Delhi will be speaking on Australia-India relations to students at the Nehru University. Of course, all ambassadors do that on a regular basis. And yesterday in Indonesia, our ambassador visited a high school in West Nusa Tenggara, one of 47 schools in Indonesia, partnering schools in Australia, to work together online on projects through the Bridge program, which is a program funded by the Australia-Indonesia Institute, by the Maya Foundation and by AusAid. Our ambassador, when he was visiting that school in Nusa Tenggara, took part in a session on Skype between teachers and students from that school and teachers and students from Mullumbimby High School in New South Wales. And that's going on all the time. I spoke in the first part of my talk about how the world was facing more challenging cross-cutting issues that need multilateral cooperation more than at any other time in the past. And DFAT also plays a big role in that. Take Afghanistan, for example. As the Prime Minister has said, Australia has two vital national interests in Afghanistan, and I'm happy to debate that any time. To make sure Afghanistan never again becomes a safe haven for terrorists, and through our substantial contribution further strengthen our alliance with the United States. Our mission in Afghanistan is to train and mentor an Afghan National Army brigade in Uruzgan province to assume responsibility for the province's security, to engage in training support for the Afghan National Police, to assist with civil policing functions in Uruzgan, and to help improve the Afghan government's capacity to deliver services and economic opportunities to its people, especially in Uruzgan. DFAT has played and is playing an important role in this. For instance, providing the civilian leadership for the coalition in Uruzgan province. And this week, our ambassador in Kabul has met with the commander of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan with other ambassadors to discuss recommendations for starting the transition process agreed by the Lisbon summit a few months ago. He met with the lead Afghan minister on reintegration to discuss possible visits by him to Uruzgan for a peace and reconciliation event in that province in March. And he met the Afghan Civil Service Commission to talk about how to get more public servants into Uruzgan. The government is committed to the United Nations as the premier global body promoting a rules-based international order that enhances our security. We lead a vigorous campaign for a non-permanent seat on the Security Council in 2013-14, and membership of that council not only is important in terms of Afghanistan, East Timor, it's also important in terms of Iran, Burma and North Korea. And we have national interests in all of that. Negotiating trade deals that enhance Australia's prosperity and help keep it competitive is also an important job for DFAT. In the 20 years since the department was negotiating the Uruguay round, Australia's trade has grown almost fourfold. More than 1 in 5, or 2.5 million Australian jobs, are trade related. Trade contributes up to $3,900 to the budget of an average working family per year in Australia. We know further gains can be realised both through high quality bilateral FTAs and through the Doha round in Geneva. And that is why on Monday of this week our ambassador in Geneva was at a meeting with the WTO Director General and a small number of other ambassadors advancing that. I mentioned earlier the environment and climate change. Our head of mission in Nairobi this week is leading an Australian delegation to the Governing Council of the UN Environment Programme. And in South Africa today, our mission is assisting Mr Rudd with his visit to attend the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on global sustainability. I've talked earlier about mobility. We issued 1.77 million passports last year. About 17% of the total number of people employed in DFAT work on passports, something which is often overlooked. We activate our Consular Crisis Centre several times a year. At the moment, earlier this week, we had 2 crisis centres going simultaneously, one working on New Zealand, one working on Libya. In the evacuation of citizens from Egypt earlier this month, DFAT Crisis Centre operated 24 hours a day from the 29th of January to the 9th of February. It involved 315 staff in Canberra. The centre fielded 4,200 calls and operators made a further 8,200 calls to confirm the safety and welfare of Australians. We deployed 39 additional officials to assist our embassy in Cairo, and we deployed 12 additional officials to Frankfurt to help Australians to help Australians with onward travel. We arranged 2 Qantas charter flights which evacuated 293 people, and 1 member of staff in Cairo spent 3 days straight without a break and without a change of clothes at Cairo airport helping Australians get out. But that is not a one-off. In Lebanon in 2006, 93 officers were sent to the region and assisted in the evacuation of 5,164 people on planes, ferries and buses. We plan ahead for those sort of eventualities where possible, and that is why yesterday in Ankara our ambassador held an embassy-wide meeting on preparations for Anzac Day on Gallipoli, an event which attracts 10,000 Australians now a year and many VIPs. And that's why our High Commissioner in Vanuatu used this week, when the country was hit by a cyclone, to meet with the CEO of a hotel, the head of the airport and core mission staff to update planning in the event of a consular crisis. So finally, DFAT pursues our security upstream. We work to advance Australia's global and regional environment, deepening understanding, cooperation and security with regional and global partners, participating with energy in global and regional forums, helping shape the emerging regional and global architecture, and pursuing greater trade and economic integration, and seeking to ensure, where possible, the safety and security of Australians abroad. So the themes of our work, political, trade, consular and security, are very much mutually reinforcing. This is the policy agenda my department seeks to pursue. Its overseas network of 95 posts enables immediate and authoritative input into the policy development process here in Canberra, touching national security and most other areas of domestic policy development. It's a broad mandate, and its range of activities is also broad globally, as I hope that I've helped demonstrate. So thank you very much for that. I'm very happy to take any questions. Happy to take. Yes, please.
You spoke about the United States as an umbrella over much of Southeast Asia, and you implied that it was a good thing. Are you going to stand there and tell us that the United States, the killing of some 3 million Vietnamese, was somehow contributing to their security? And don't think for a second, just a moment.
Anything about it.
Just a moment. Don't think that the My Lai massacre, when hundreds of young of men, women and children were mown down by American troops, is that security?
Let me answer that. I think the points you make there are perfectly reasonable. I do understand them. You might, if you listen to my speech, you would be aware that I spoke of the period over the last 7 decades, and I do believe the United States, I do believe its security umbrella in respect to the Asia Pacific over the last 7 decades has been a force for good. You may disagree, but that's my view. Thank you.
Try telling the Vietnamese that.
Sorry, I'm not the old man out. I've had the pleasure on the rumbles of direct negotiations with the Americans about what happened in World War II in the Pacific. And everybody seems to know the story that a bomb was used in the final wrangle. There's obviously not too many documents around. Can you help identify those circumstances, or can you, if I rang your office, can you direct me to some area I could talk to about it?
Well, I don't think so. We wouldn't have those.
No one seems to.
You're talking about the US and the decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I hear it in more sometimes an attack. So German purposes in the Pacific, which is sort of censored out at the time to resolve the future in Europe. That's all I've been told about it. And Obama, if it's true in speaking, has admitted the circumstances. But I know there's no exact stats or on losses or defence assets and things like that you can really identify. And if it's all true, people would have panicked because well and truly.
I'm not quite sure of the question, but I think you would need to pursue that with the US. I think you would need, please.
Mr. Richardson, can you comment on the impact of WikiLeaks on the future of diplomacy?
Sorry? Yeah, on the impact of WikiLeaks on the future of diplomacy. Look, different people have a lot of different views on that. My own personal view is that it won't very much change the nature of diplomacy or the way governments interact with each other. That's my own personal view. I say that because I believe whether at a personal level, whether at an organisational level, or whether at an international level, there is there will always be a need for individuals and countries to come together and talk privately. I don't believe the totality of interaction between countries can be done before the public eye. However, governments do have an obligation to be as transparent as possible. That's my own personal view. I think there might be a few countries around the world looking at their communication systems and looking at the way they operate internally to ascertain whether what happened in the US case could also happen in their own environment. But I don't believe it will have a big impact on the way countries work together.
Mr. Richardson, the use of Chinese soft power to development of educational programs, infrastructure programs, would appear to me an opportunity for Australia to work very effectively bilaterally with China in Asia, Pacific and Africa. I'd be interested in your views on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, Jason. If you, indeed, we've already had some talks with China about the Pacific and about doing different work together, and education would certainly be one of them.
Mr. Richardson, in regard to the sort of international and regional dialogues, would you say that the G20 has sort of effectively displaced the G7 and G8 and then making it perhaps more relevant to the region as the East Asian Summit displaced the ASEAN Regional Forum and ASEAN Plus 4, I think it is at the moment? Are these the two emerging dialogues that we should be most concerned about?
I don't believe the EAS has replaced the ASEAN Plus 3, it is, the ASEAN Plus 3, but it is the East Asia Summit that actually brings together the collection of countries that are most important to us. The ASEAN Plus 3 does not include India, it does not include the United States. So for us, the more significant forum is the EAS. In respect to the G20 and the G7-8, I don't believe the G20 has entirely replaced the G7, G8, and indeed the G7-8, because it is a yet smaller grouping, does at times address political and other non-economic issues which I think would be a bridge too far at this point for the G20. The G20 remains very much focused on the global economy, and I think that is where it will. It has in Seoul last November, it brought in a development agenda, and President Sarkozy is talking about possibly widening the agenda further in the Paris G20 meeting later this year. But I think I don't see the G20 as a rival to the G7-8 in all its dimensions at this point.
Thank you. I was very interested to hear that we're moving forward on India, renewing our contacts with India. As we've just been talking about regional fora, I wonder if you'd like to comment on the importance of Australia now being Vice Chair of the IOR-ARC and then President from 2013. That seems to be an enormous opportunity for us to our west.
Yeah, that will give us an opportunity to work with India more closely in a regional context than what we've done in the past. Australia has not historically seen the Indian Ocean in strategic competitive terms, and it is a good thing that we haven't had to think in those terms, but over the course of the next 40 years, I don't think we can assume that that state of affairs is going to remain. So I think it's important for us to be involved at this point. I'll just talk more broadly about Australia and India because I do think it's important. We have discovered each other as two countries on a number of occasions over the decades, and indeed I accompanied Prime Minister Hawke on a visit he made to India in February of 1989, and I remember then the initiatives that we took, etc. And so it has been a bit of much of a roller coaster ride. However, with the greater liberalisation of the Indian economy, with their growth trajectory and the way in which our two economies are largely complementary, and as their strategic interests grow with their economic weight, there is a real need for us to know one another much better than what we do at the moment. And the Indian student issue did set us back. There is no denying that. And as I said in my address, it is a 3 to 5 year rebuilding program, because our standing and credibility was not only affected, if you like, at a so-called elite level, it went way beyond that and became a somewhat entrenched view within a much wider sector of the Indian population.
By a number of people in the United States, I'm talking about Julian Assange,
Yes.
and a number of people threatening, saying he should be shot, etc. Now, in that circumstance, what are you doing to make representations to the US government? He's not been charged with anything at all. And what protection are you providing him so that he should not be subject to this kind of fatwa from the US?
I think to say that he's subject to a fatwa from the US is just dead wrong. The threats and the comments that you made overwhelmingly came from some individual members of Congress. I don't believe the US administration has made any threat against his life whatsoever. We have provided consular assistance to Julian Assange from the beginning, from the time that warrant was put out in Sweden. We have provided him with assistance. We have attended, consular officials have visited him on at least 2 occasions when he was in, we visited him on 2 occasions when he was in actual prison in the UK. We have attended each day of his trial, not of his trial, of the hearing in London, and we will continue to do so. And we will, that consular assistance will continue if he is returned to Sweden. And if any other government sought to take legal action against him, then we would offer him the same consular assistance as we would any Australian. If any government made a threat against his life, we would make representations to that country, and we would express public condemnation of that, as we would in respect of any government making a threat against an Australian.
Mr. Richardson, I know you and Mr. Rudd and Dr. Emerson will be involved in the budget process at the moment, so I won't ask for specifics. But in general terms, how much investment do you believe DFAT needs to address this long-term underinvestment that most people acknowledge, so that Australia can properly meet its diplomatic requirements and also the growing consular expectations?
The challenge we face has to be also seen in historical terms. We do face an overhang between 1995 and 2008. The number of people employed under the Australian Public Service Act increased by about 12%. The number of people employed in DFAT was reduced by 5 to 6%. That is a 17–18% differential. The number of people we employed overseas, that is A-based officers overseas, between 1995 and 2008 was reduced by around 17%. Now you can't build that back quickly. We have had net increases in our budget over the last 2 years. Clearly, net increases in budget over the next 2 years is going to be enormously difficult given the fiscal environment in which we're in, and given the very legitimate commitment by the government to return the budget to surplus by 2013-14. Yep.
Can I ask also a follow-up to that last question in the consular context? The work that DFAT has done in conjunction with other departments in addressing crises overseas, particularly in Lebanon and more recently in Egypt, has been just tremendous, to say the least. And of course it's reached the Mediterranean area rather than, say, taking place in a closer environment within our region. In terms of the resources that you apply to that, there's a surge obviously required in manpower in order to address it both within Australia and overseas, and an enormous funding commitment that's required for the whole of the infrastructure that you put in place, including aircraft, ships or whatever. Could you talk about how you cope with that within the department?
No, thanks. The crisis in Lebanon in 2006 cost a lot. The one in Egypt, the marginal dollar cost was not as great as you might think. For instance, whoever we send, whoever we deploy around the world, they're being paid whether they're deployed or whether they're not. The marginal cost is in their airfare and in whatever accommodation and in allowances. They're the three marginal costs. The additional marginal cost for Egypt was the chartering of two Qantas 747s. We chartered them at a cost of around $270,000 each, and we covered the cost of quite a number of Australians who left Egypt. Although interestingly enough, the vast majority of Australians who left Egypt left under their own steam, because throughout the crisis, despite the chaotic scenes at Cairo International Airport over a number of days, there were commercial aircraft landing and taking off during non-curfew hours on each of those days. We have not yet worked out the net marginal cost to us of Egypt, but it's probably not much more than $1 million. And however, were it to be significantly more, etc., we would have the right to go to the Department of Finance and deregulation and actually seek additional monies. But the cost of a lot of these crises we simply absorb ourselves. We essentially rob Peter to pay Paul. We take people offline from doing other activity and we move them into the consular crisis centre or deploy them overseas. So the cost is not only a dollar cost, the cost is the opportunity cost of what we're not doing, which we otherwise would have been doing, because we don't have the resources. I mean, clearly we're never going to be resourced to just comfortably move into a crisis and handle it without deploying anyone. But at the moment, we do have to sometimes deploy, I think, excessive numbers of people, given the size of the organisation, in order to meet the demands of the crisis.
For those who haven't been to this lecture series before, the routine now is two things. I'm going to in a moment say thank you to Dennis, and then I'll invite the students and the staff from the University of Canberra to come forward and have a chat with Dennis. Thank you very much for coming today. Thank you for coming out and putting up with the pests on the roof. Big possums, I think, we've got out here at Bruce. But thank you for a very full coverage of the changes in our global environment and the regional implications of that, but in particular the implications for Australia, and how we need to, as a country with global responsibilities, and as you detailed very clearly, global power in our own right, how we deal with that and make our future safe and secure as part of a safe and secure region. I was particularly taken with your comments about your diplomats thinking, advocating and persuading. And I'd like to think that that's what we're trying to do here at the University of Canberra, have our students think, and sometimes it's pretty hard, and I'm not looking at you, Gavin, but it's pretty hard to challenge them with the size and the complexity of the problems that we face. And it's lectures like yours and others that we've had last year and we will have this year that allow us to understand those problems and think about how we as academics and as students can make Australia a safer place. So on behalf of the University of Canberra and the Vice-Chancellor, thank you for coming out, and I invite the audience to thank you. And if